Welcome, adventurers. Today, I want to talk about the Kineticist because it is rapidly becoming one of my favorite classes in the system. I recently played in a sort of a one-shot alongside a Kineticist, and I was absolutely floored at how effective this class is. So I want to talk about its versatility in combat, also talk about some of the things it can do outside of combat, and then take a look at each one of the elements to show off those features. Starting with the versatility. Remember, Elemental Blast can be done in 1 or 2 actions, ranged or melee. If it is 2 actions, you add your Constitution modifier to damage. If it is melee, you add your Strength modifier to damage. How does that damage compare to other characters in the system? Let's compare to casters first, because Kineticists are closer to casters overall than they are to your martial characters. A caster using a cantrip like Telekinetic Projectile, which is 2 actions, will do 2d6 of damage. That is an average of 7 points of damage. Elemental Blast, on the other hand, well, that's going to be typically a d8 plus 4 for your plus 4 Constitution. That is an average of 8.5. So that is a higher average, and it is a much higher floor. So that is a big win for the Kineticist. Comparing to martials, this is a bit harder to compare because I'm going to take a look at a 2-handed Bastard Sword Strike, which is only 1 action compared to the 2 action of Elemental Blast. So keep that in mind. But a 2-handed Bastard Sword Strike would be a 1d12 plus 4. That's 10.5 average. Elemental Blast, presuming a plus 2 strength, is going to have the same average because you would have a d8 plus 4 from your Constitution and a plus 2 from your Strength. So same average there, but a much higher floor, which I think wins in a tiebreaker. But then again, 1 action versus 2. So it's not quite clearly as ahead in damage as a martial, but I think it still wins out in the end due to the versatility. Let's first compare the versatility of the variable actions compared to casters. Casters have almost no 1-action damage options. They can use weapons and make strikes, and that's kind of about it. But there aren't really any... I mean, there are some focus spells, don't get me wrong. But cantrips are going to be 2 actions, and that means if you need 2 actions to move, or 1 action to move, or 1 action to take something out, or whatever, you often can't choose to do any damage with your 3rd action. But as a Kineticist, if you want to use maybe a 2-action buffing or healing impulse, or you need 2 actions to do something, whatever it happens to be, you still have that 1 action left and can still do a 1-action ranged Elemental Blast and at least do a little bit of chip damage. That is fantastic. Then comparing this to martials, well, I think it is tough to balance range and melee as a martial. You either need to swap weapons, or you need 1-handed melee, which will be lesser damage, and a 1-handed range weapon in the other hand, which also tends to be a little lesser damage. Then you need to deal with reloading, which can be actions or needing to drop a weapon or something like that. Or maybe you have a combination weapon, but then you need to take an action to switch from range to melee. Also, your strength might be much higher than your dexterity if you are typically a melee combatant, and then if you switch to a ranged weapon, you will be less accurate. That doesn't affect the Kineticist that way. And then, okay, maybe as a martial, you are dexterity based, but then that means you have a much lesser strength usually, so you're not as effective in melee range, not doing quite as much damage as you would be from range. So overall, compared to Elemental Blast, where you have the same attack bonus whether you are ranged or melee, and there's no reloading, I think the Kineticist wins. And then finally onto skills and teamwork. Yes, true, due to Constitution being your key ability score, you won't have that natural built-in diplomacy like a charisma-based caster would. You won't have that natural built-in crafting like an alchemist would. But it's not impossible, especially with the level 5 skill junctions that we will take a look at a bit. And then plus a lot of the impulses that you can choose help out in ways other than pure damage. There are some buffing, debuffing, kind of healing abilities that are offered to you in combat as a Kineticist. All right, let's take a look at the elements starting in alphabetical order with air. I have built out a couple of, not completely 1 to 5, but 1 through 5 with some of the feats filled in for each of the elements and only using single gates. Remember, as a kineticist, you can be you can focus on one element or two, single or dual gate, but if you focus on one, you get some extra benefits, so that's what we're going to look at here. For the air elemental, I went with an elf. We're going to talk about why that's important. Scout, because the air elemental is kind of all about movement, and I think that a scout makes a lot of sense there. Of course, kineticist. I'm going with the Whisper Elf Heritage, the Nimble Elf Ancestry feat. This is important. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then you see my class feats here. I'm going with 4 winds, Aerial Boomerang, which we'll talk about. But what I want to get to is the single kinetic gate air element impulse junction. What do we get from that? Air impulse junction. Before or after the effects of the impulse, this is any 2-action impulse, you can either stride up to half your speed or step. Now that is before or after. Speed, half. So remember that elf. We have a base movement now of 30 feet because we're an elf. That means we can stride 15 feet rather than 10 feet, which is what most characters could do. And then we have the nimble elf, which gives us an extra 5-foot movement. And then guess what? At level 3, we're going to take fleet so that we have 40 feet of movement. Now we can move 20 feet as part of this air impulse junction. I think that plays into the air being the movement-based element really well. And plus, it sets you up to do things like you can use these area of effect impulses like aerial boomerang. And before you use it, you can move 20 feet to get into the perfect position to do that area of effect damage. And then you still have an action because as part of that impulse, you got to move. Then you do the 2-action impulse, and then you can throw out a 1-action elemental blast or get out of the way or something like that. As we move on, I think there are some fun sort of team buff protection abilities like air cushion. You slow a target's fall speed, which is pretty cool. And then air shroud, you impose a penalty to ranged weapons. So you can kind of set up an air shroud in your aura and protect you and your allies from incoming fire. At level 5, remember, if you choose to expand the portal to double down on your chosen element, you can pick a new impulse junction. Gate junction it's called at this point. And there are 4 different kinds. We're going to pick from the variety of those kinds here. But for this, I decided to go with the aura junction. This is another thing that happens in your aura. You and any ally that starts its turn in the aura gets a +10 status bonus to land speed until the end of the turn. So at this point, you would have a land speed of 50 feet. That is incredible. And of course, this is helpful to all of your allies. What might that look like? Well, this is what I drew up. There's my Elven Air Elemental. Kineticist, very wispy. Look at that. All right, moving on to the Earth Kineticist. Let's go ahead and take a look at that art. Should have done that first with the Air Elemental, but there we go. This is going to be our sort of melee, brutal combat Kineticist. That is because Earth has a lot of features that focus on armor class, which is obviously good for being a melee combatant. I went with a dwarf for this one. So moving on to here, I went with a rock dwarf because, well, that just makes sense for the Earth Kineticist. Unburdened Iron. Now, this is important because we are also taking the Armor and Earth class feature here, which is a pretty hefty +4 armor. That's medium armor, but it uses our light armor proficiency, but it does have a speed penalty of -10 feet. Now we'll get to ignore some of that because we do meet the strength requirements, but Unburdened Iron means we get to ignore the rest of that. So we still have our full movement, which again is not a lot because we're a dwarf, only 20 feet, but we have this pretty rockin' AC of 18, huge hit points, and most importantly, we can do a lot of damage. If we are doing a 2-action melee elemental blast, that is going to be a D8 plus 4 from the Constitution, plus 3 from the Strength. That's going to be an average of 11.5 points of damage, and that is pretty hefty. Now, as far as the Impulse Junction here, again, kind of impacting what we are doing for being an up-close melee combatant here. Where is it? Earth Impulse Junction. There we go. +1 circumstance bonus to AC until the start of her next turn. Incredible. I mean, if that's not designed to be up front and swinging, I don't know what is. A couple of the other options, or not, I guess, options, but pieces of background about this character. I did choose the minor background because that just makes sense. And that does give us some terrain expertise. And I also decided to go with some thievery training. We've got our lore, mining. I think the thievery is, you know, you're just kind of, you're pocketing in a few pieces for yourself. You got to retire, right? And then at level 5, we're going to get a little more protection even with calcifying sand reaction. And then I kind of leaned into this skill junction here. The Earthgate skill junction. While your kinetic aura is active, you gain a +1 bonus to the listed skill of athletics. So this is going to be, I mean, it's a very strong character already. We're going to lean even more into that with our athletics bonus here. And then we're going to pick up Hefty Hauler, which I think just makes awesome sense for being a miner. You're used to carrying a bunch of stuff. And that means you can be a little bit of a pack mule for your team, carry all that loot that you otherwise might have to leave behind. All right, on to Fire. Fire is kind of all about damage, and here I have my Fire, of course, Goblin Kineticist. This Kineticist is a cook by background, which makes sense with fire. And due to that background, and due to some of the feats later on, this is a build that is going to lean a little bit into crafting, and even healing through elixirs, through some alchemical crafting, which is something you might not think of right away when thinking about the Kineticist, because you don't necessarily assume intelligence, but we are going to build out a +2 intelligence for this character. We are going to not go so heavy on anything else. You see, there's no strength bonus here. This is more of a ranged fighter, but that is perfect because the fire element has a greater range than the others. It does have less damage, but the Fire Impulse Junction increase the damage die size of the fire damage dealt by the impulse by 1 step. So, even though, if we take a look at Elemental Blast, you see here that fire only does D6. Oops, let me open that up again. Fire D6, whereas most of the others are D8. Air is also D6. If we're doing a 2-action Elemental Blast, that actually becomes a D8. And that is at 60 feet range rather than 30. So that's pretty massive. At level 2, we're going to go with that alchemical crafting, remember? That is because our background, the cook background, is going to give us a +1 bonus to craft food, drink, and elixirs. So we can make some good elixirs of life. We can help be a bit of a party supplier there. And then at level 5, the Blazing Wave Impulse feat is just too fun to pass up, and we are again going to expand the portal, stay with fire, and let's take a look at what we get here. I really like the aura junctions, if you couldn't tell. Another aura junction, an aura for the fire is enemies in your kinetic aura gain weakness to fire from your impulses. So this is great. Now, generally, you don't want enemies in your aura close to you as this character because you don't have that AC, you don't have a huge HP because you're a goblin, you're kind of smaller and squishier. But if something does get close, well, now you have the ability to blast it because it is going to be weak to your fire. On to the metal. This one I'm quite excited about. I mean, I like them all, but this one I think is cool. Here is my metal Kineticist. Look at that guy. His chainmail, his cool jacket. He's got some welder's gloves, some goggles, because he is also a bit of a crafter, a bit of a healer, and of course, he's, rocking the extreme damage that the metal sort of area of effect specialist can do. So what we're getting with this build is good range damage and then some crafting and also some healing. So I did invest a bit in wisdom and I went with the risky surgery general feat. Now, this is kind of fun, I think, because risky surgery literally says you cut someone open before you heal. And I think for a metal elementalist who's going to have a lot of, sharp metal things that he creates or has on him, that just makes sense. I'm going with Incredible Initiative because this is a character that has some good area of effect, and I want to be able to get into the right position by having by beating some of the enemies into initiative, getting the right spot, and blasting them. As far as crafting goes, again, we are investing in intelligence, and then some of the some of the metal abilities later on, like Flash Forge, and also Magnetic Field are very craft adjacent. They're not necessarily crafting, but it all is sort of in the same mindset, same sort of flavor. I really do like the risky surgery, but of course, as you level up, you're going to want to increase your wisdom as soon as you can at level 5, and you're also going to want to level up your medicine training because having a +5 at level 1 is not that great for your rolls, but you do get a bonus due to risky surgery, so that's cool. And then at level 5, we already talked about magnetic field, but let's talk about the skill junction that this character is going to pick up at level 5. Skill junction, we are going to get a bonus to crafting, and we are going to get quick repair as a feat. So again, leaning into the crafting and forging of this character, which is part of the flavor of the metal element. I think this one would be a lot of fun, a lot of utility in your party with the healing and crafting, and then being pretty darn decent in combat as well. On to water. Here I have my Water Azerketi Kineticist. This background just makes sense. They are aquatic people, so of course we're going to go with the water element here. And I went with the River Azerketi because I'm imagining this character as being someone who was, as you can see here in the background, an emissary. So they traveled along the riverways, and that is why they actually have a pretty decent charisma score and are trained in diplomacy, a city lore, and society. So this could actually be someone who's a bit of the face of the party. It is a possibility as the Kineticist. They are a bit of a healer as well, which I think makes sense, being a bit more diplomatic, and that is due to the Ocean's Balm impulse. You touch a living creature, it regains 1d8 hit points. The water element has kind of a lot of healing in it, which makes sense, water being kind of the most important thing for life, right? As far as the water impulse feat, let's take a look at, or impulse junction, let's take a look at what that does. After the impulse's other effects, you can move one creature targeted by the impulse or in its area 5 feet in any direction. So this is good for a little bit of battlefield control. You can hit something and then push it away, which could be quite helpful if something is getting a bit too close to you. You're doing decent in AC and hit points, but you're not quite the full upfront tank as some of the others were. And then at level 5, getting more into battlefield control with winter sleet, you create ice around you and it makes people fall down. Now, this could actually be perfect for setting up a defensive line, because you could do something like have your allies get close to you, go ahead and use this ability. And as long as your allies aren't moving, from what I read, they don't have to make an acrobatics check to try to not slip. So you can let the enemies come to you and fall, and then have your marshals just wail on them, and then you wail on them with elemental blast, and then push them out with the impulse junction, and then make them come back and fall again. I mean, it would be almost broken. Now, as far as the gate junction goes, we haven't actually used a resistance junction yet, but that's what we're going to do here, because you gain a resistance to fire and water. Now, I think this is important for the water Kineticist, because fire damage from enemies is, I think, one of the most common types of elemental damages you'll take. And then a lot of those monsters that deal fire damage, well, they're weak to water. So by being resistant to their damage and triggering their weakness, you are going to be a very formidable opponent to a pretty large section of the monster of the monster bestiary out there. So it might take a little bit before you truly shine in combat and can like do more damage than other characters, but you, in the right situation, will be an absolute beast on the battlefield. And finally, this takes us to the wood element, which is actually my favorite, and I'm going to use a Kenrasu for this. I don't really know how to build one in Hero Forge, so here's a picture. That's kind of what it would look like. I think they're so cool. I love this ancestry. As far as the build goes, oops, let's not do that. I really like wood because it focuses on some pretty cool healing abilities. And then with this build, I also used a couple of abilities to make it pretty decent in combat as well. For the background, I chose Herbalist so that, well, we can use natural medicine for healing. I think that's going to be pretty cool. We are going to go with some sort of forestry ancestry feats here with Rite of Passage and Wilderness Born. Hardwood armor we're going to use to protect ourselves, to be a pretty up close but not fully up close combatant. We're not going to get quite up to the enemy all the time because we're going to use Weapon Infusion. Now this is a great feat available to all Kineticists. You can change where you can infuse a weapon trait into your elemental blast. So for melee, you can choose one of your choice: agile, backswing, forceful, reach, or sweep. So reach means you don't have to be right next to an enemy, and you can still do that absolutely wicked constitution plus strength plus your roll damage. And then ranged, you could do the same by choosing something with propulsive. If you're 50 feet up to 50 feet away in propulsive, you will still deal a little damage from your strength. Or 20 feet with the thrown trait, though I did think, is there any reason to use reach? Because don't you get to add your strength modifier to anything that's thrown? So wouldn't you be able to do as much damage there as you would with reach? Let me know if I got that wrong in the comments, but I think it means you can do your strength plus your constitution plus a d8 from up to 20 feet by using the weapon infusion to use the thrown trait, I think. As far as our final feat here, we're going to go with fresh produce. You grow a little fruit that heals your allies. The impulse junction for this, I think, is very cool. You gain temporary hit points equal to your level that lasts until the start of your next turn. So this supports this character being not all the way up front, but quite close to the front line and being able to stay safe. As you move on, I like leaning into a bit of protection and battlefield control. Timber Sentinel. Cool. Cool impulse. It's protector tree, but that means you can get up close to your front line, lay down a Timber Sentinel, a protector tree, keep the front line safe, do that medium range damage. You can then Ravel of Thorns for some excellent battlefield control, and then at level 5. When you double down on the wood element, you're going to go with your aura junction here. Life-giving blossoms spring up around you. Any ally that begins its turn in the aura gains 1 temporary hit point that lasts. So you're offering that temporary hit point bonus to your allies as well. And then I did go a little bit to level 6 because Wooden Palisade, I mean, you build a fortress, basically. How does it get any better than that? It's such a cool element. I love this element. I like the class overall. I hope this was helpful. I think that I will be doing a re-ranking of the classes shortly, and that the elements, well, the Kineticist is probably going to be, you know, maybe top 5 now. I think it was already rated pretty high if I remember, but it's got to be up there even more. All right, well, this was fun. I feel like this was digestible since there are only 6 elements. It might be harder to do with something like the Druid, but if you have thoughts on another class that I should cover in this way, leave a note in the comments, and I'll see you next time, adventurers. Take care.